There are some practical considerations in this, strategic ones. And you'll see that the two focal points of this conference will turn out to be at the end as they are at the beginning. The issue of Eurasian recovery, Eurasian development as the pivot for world recovery, including the role of Russia as a very special part of any such recovery effort, and the relationship of this Eurasian commitment to the contrasting situation of Africa. In other words, to understand the world as a whole in the simplest terms of reference, look at the possibility of what we can do in Eurasia, and then look at the needs of Africa in order to see humanity in its wholeness. Those who have the means to lift themselves up, and those on whose behalf, in the larger term, they must act to lift them up too. Because the idea of the general welfare, while it's a notion of government of each nation, also must be a notion of the relationships among the nations of the world. We must find a community of principle in the notion of the general welfare to unite nations for a common good. The common good is the general welfare of the nations, of the people in each, and of the community of nations as a group. It's the only chance for this planet. Now, to go to the question of what is the role of Russia. I addressed this yesterday in a forum. We had a seminar yesterday, and I shall restate it again here. Germany, like the rest of Western Europe and Central Europe, is also bankrupt. This is a condition which was installed immediately in 1989 through 1991, when the Soviet system collapsed, and was collapsed. At that point, since there was no credible adversary, the Anglo-American powers, led by Margaret Thatcher, who was made prime minister out of the wreckage of a greengrocer's daughter, George Bush, a mental case, the old George Bush, the young George Bush came by his mental infirmities honestly. It's only their money that they got dishonestly. And Francois Mitterrand. And these people set up a plan to prevent Germany from surviving the reunification of Germany, and set up a plan to destroy Eastern Europe, especially Russia. That was their plan. And if you look at the history since 1989, 1990, you'll see the result. That's exactly what happened. It was intentional. The plan was that they launched globalization, which was to destroy the last vestige of the sovereign nation state on this planet through globalization, to set up a modern financier oligarchical form of the Roman Empire, this time on a world scale, in which there would be one world government, which would be run out of London and Washington in concert with Canada, with Australia and New Zealand. And that's what's been happening. NATO is a joke. Nobody treats NATO seriously. NATO is nothing but an appendage of the Anglo-American facility, sometimes with French cooperation, sometimes not. There is no NATO. There is no sovereignty in Europe, inefficiently. A world empire is emerging. A world empire with pagan Roman characteristics and fascism to boot. After all, fascism is nothing but Caesarism revived in the modern age. That's the intention. So under these conditions, Germany, which is being ruined, and you see it, the Chancellor every time they turn around, Eichel every time he turns around, they're cutting more, they're cutting more. The situation is desperate. The budget is unbalanced. The French budget is unbalanced. The Italian budget, well, they're used to it, so they put up with it better. It's always unbalanced. Other countries' budgets are unbalanced. They're cutting, but they're already below break-even, long below break-even. These nations cannot survive on their present budgets. They cannot survive physically on their present budgets. They're headed toward hell with no way out, no exit in sight. Now, Germany used to be the pivot of the European economy. And since they got rid of de Gaulle in France and so forth and crushed Italy, that most of Europe couldn't earn its own living, Western Europe. And the way in which Western Europe as a whole survived was through the margin contributed from Germany, a Germany whose ability to contribute to support the rest of the poor nations of Europe. They were all living on the German dole. It was Germany's high technology export capabilities. And as long as Germany maintained that those export capabilities, which it did up until about 1990, until the assassination of Herrhausen in 1989, then Germany could sustain Western continental Europe by providing the margin of balance by which Italy, France, and so forth could survive without collapsing. But what was done to Germany in the process of reunification, the way the operation was handled in the assimilation of the former East Germany, destroyed Germany from within too. And thus Germany is at a point that it cannot survive and Western Europe cannot survive the way things are going. So there's the obvious solution. There's a great potential market under the proper conditions in Asia, in China, India, other countries, which represent the largest portion of the human population. In a great area of particularly Central and North Asia, which is one of the great frontiers of growth of all humanity, an area of tundra and deserts and general underdevelopment. So through the mediation of Russia, which has a peculiarity historically of being a Eurasian nation per se, it's a result of the aftermath of the Mongol occupation. Through that mediation, it is possible for Europe to unite with Russia and nations in Asia to set up a long-term system under which, instead of consumer goods markets for these countries and consumer goods investments for these countries, you set up long-term development of the productive powers of labor in these nations, which means you're talking about a generation or more, which means a system of long-term credit issued by those nations which are producing the greater part of the technology production to the nations which need that supplement in order to get out of the mess they're in. So this means a system of long-term credit. This means interest rates in the order of 1% per annum, simple interest, no compound interest. Long-term agreements under which the great markets called need in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, now come into a partnership with Europe, with Russia, with Japan, and so forth, in order to create a great economic boom with some of the same features that were used to rebuild Western Europe in the immediate post-war period, through the various Marshall Plan and other programs, through the Kreditanstalt for Wiederaufbau in Germany, for example. That kind of program for a generation of recovery, a generation of progress, a generation of development. And in order to make this work, as has been understood for more than a century, almost a century and a half now, the only way this could be worked was to develop a system of infrastructural development which would effectively link the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean across Eurasia. Now this is not railroads, this is not Silk Roads, these are corridors of development, corridors which run a range of, say, 100 kilometers in width, up to 100 kilometers, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, going in various directions, north, south, and so forth. Along these routes, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, that the area on either side of the transportation axis becomes immediately in and of itself a sustainable area of economic development. Then by that means you can branch out from the main corridors into subsidiary corridors of development and capture the area. If we make that kind of link, you have one interesting change occurs immediately. For as long as we know, mankind's economy has been dominated by the oceans. Contrary to all these theories that the British biblical archaeologists tell you, civilization did not come from inland and march down the rivers to the seas. It went the other way. Everything we know, especially the information on the internal characteristics of ancient astronomical calendars, shows that these astronomical calendars were predominantly the calendars used by a transoceanic maritime culture functioning a long period of time when most of North Eurasia was under a giant glacier for about 100,000 years. And during that period, most of what became later civilization was running around the oceans. And from the time that these maritime cultures came back into Eurasia, following the melting of the glacier about 20,000 years ago, when that began, was to move inland. And the first directions were to move along the great riverways inland, to move along the coastways, close to the seas and close to the maritime traffic. And if you look at the map of the world, you'll find the characteristic of development, or non-development, is the lack of the ability to utilize efficiently the inland areas, the landlocked areas of the world, with the same degree of efficiency and productivity we can use the coastal areas and the chief riverways. So therefore, if you look in Central Asia, what do you see? You see, here's the heart of it. In China, you have a coastal area of China which reflects this, which is more highly developed, relatively speaking, and inland, the area is poorly developed, the population has a poorer standard of living, poor opportunities for development. This extends then into Central and North Asia as a whole. Therefore, if we conquer this area, what happens? Take a transportation alone. People will think today, who don't think, will think that ocean freight is the cheapest way to move freight. It's not true. The cheapest way to move freight is across land, not by truck. Trucks running up and down the highway tell you that the economy is being mismanaged. Too many trucks. It's not efficient. Costs too much. Intrinsically bad. Railways are much better. Integrated transport systems featuring railways, especially magnetic levitation systems, are excellent. Magnetic levitation systems move passengers more rapidly, but magnetic levitation systems for moving cargo, for freight, that is really a wonder. That's where the payoff comes. If you can move freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo at an average rate of 300 kilometers per hour, without much stopping along the way, and if for every 100 kilometers of motion across that route you are generating the creation of wealth through production as a result of the existence of that corridor, then the cost of moving freight from Rotterdam to Tokyo is less than zero and can be up to 200 to 300 kilometers per hour. Now, what ocean freight system can do that? Did you ever see a large supercargo ship producing wealth while it was traveling across the ocean? And at what speed? So therefore, we've come to a turning point in technology, which have emerged over recent periods, where the development of the internal landmass of the world and the great typical frontier is Central and North Asia. It's the greatest opportunity, single opportunity, before all mankind for development. Now this requires some revolutionary changes in the way we think about things. This means that we would be engaged in the greatest change in the environment in the history of mankind. This single project, say a 25-year or more, development of Central and North Asia in this direction, including the conquest of the tundra. The Arctic tundra is one of the great frontiers to be mastered. It can be done. Would mean a great change in the environment. Now, how are we going to decide what is good and bad about changing the environment? Well, what people think today about the environment is pretty stupid. It's wrong, doesn't make any sense, they don't know what they're talking about. And you see the kind of education you get, no wonder they believe that nonsense. Especially people with physics degrees who don't know which end is up. But the great theory of the environment was established by a Russian of Ukrainian credentials, Vladimir Vernadsky, with his concept of geobiochemistry. See, what you're taught, the problem here is you're taught in most universities and elsewhere about science is nonsense. It's a damn lie, most of it, to put it frankly. What you're taught as basic physics is mostly a lie. Because we know from, as Vernadsky demonstrated this in his own way, and others have known it and shown it, that there are actually three principles involved in man's physical relationship to the earth and the universe. Three categories. One, the category we call non-living processes. What most people who aren't well educated call physical processes. Yeah? The second one, which some people don't understand, those in molecular biology, they refuse to understand it. It's called the principle of life. You will never get life out of a non-living process. Life is, as Pasteur insisted, is a principle unto itself. But how it's a universal physical principle, which, as Vernadsky demonstrated with his biogeochemistry, is that the history of Earth is what? The oceans and the atmosphere were produced by living processes. Down several kilometers in the Earth's surface, most of the Earth that we are in touch with as humanity was created as a byproduct of living processes. What Vernadsky calls the natural products of the biosphere. We can measure it. We can measure the power of the biosphere over the non-living process. We can measure it. Living processes are superior to non-living processes. They're more powerful. They're apparently weak, but their long-term effects are more powerful than the short-term effects of the non-living processes. Now there's a third thing, which again Kant won't let you know. Immanuel Kant. That's why they call him Kant, because he can't do anything. If you believe him, you can't do anything either. The essential nature of man is that we are capable of making discoveries of universal physical principle. Discoveries we can validate in known experimental ways. By applying these principles, we increase our power in the universe in ways that can be measured physically per capita and per square kilometer. We can measure this in terms of the demographic effect of this kind of action. That is, does the human species improve its life expectancy, its power to exist in the universe as a result of this? Yes, it does. That's good. Mankind actually is primary mastery of nature has occurred in terms of man's mastery and development of the biosphere. So actually the biosphere is including what we call basic economic infrastructure, such as waterways, power systems, transportation systems. These are the development of cities, of good cities at least. These are natural products of cognition which are reflected as improvements in the biosphere. The biosphere is weak. It is stupid. It does not know how to deal with the deserts it has. It does not know how to deal with the tundras. It does not know how to deal with other problems that it has. But we as human beings can come to our poor stupid slave, the biosphere, and say, we will educate you and we will make you stronger and better. So mankind intervenes in the biosphere to make the biosphere better. And so the principles of discovery, the application or discovery of principles applied to the environment creates the natural products of cognition in the biosphere which improves the biosphere. which increases the potential for human life. So this is not a mysterious, arbitrary area. This is an area of science. It's an area of scientific precision, which would mean that the job to do is not to say, is it good or bad to tamper with the environment? It's very good to tamper with the environment if you know what you're doing. But you have to develop the science of water management, the science of transportation, the science of reforestation, the science of how to change and control the atmosphere and the climate. You can't make big mistakes. These mistakes will live with you for a quarter century or longer. You can't make big mistakes. Therefore, you have to have competent people, competent groups of people, making the determination of how we do this. But by changing the biosphere of Central and North Asia, and changing the biosphere in the arid areas of China and so forth, we will create the greatest boon for humanity in any part of this planet. What we need is a task-oriented mission task force to undertake the policy planning for precisely this, and it must be international. Now, the peculiar part of this is the case of Russia. Russia has gone from communism to liberalism without passing go, and certainly without getting $20 or $200. It got nothing. As a matter of fact, it lost money on the deal, as anyone knows. So Russia, the problem in Russia is to define itself, again, intention. This will work if Russia adopts the intention of playing that role for itself in a Eurasian development program, which means leading people in Russia must adopt such a perspective. And the Russian people must increasingly participate in that vision of the role of Russia in changing the situation in Eurasia and in Russia itself. Under those conditions, therefore, the role of Russia as a pivot with other parts of Eurasia is crucial. How? Well, first of all, there are conflicts of a historical and cultural nature among most of the nations of Asia. China and India, for example. China and Japan. Korea with China and Japan. And so forth and so on. So that on a bilateral basis, long-term agreements among these nations are very difficult to manage. However, if you have a common mission with a common interest, which involves a great number of these nations together, then you can bring them together in the system of cooperation. This is the natural role in which Russia can play a mediating part throughout Eurasia. What came up with Primakov, when Primakov was prime minister, on the triangular cooperation which we boosted very much and pushed for, among Russia, China, and India, to bring the nations of Asia together in this form. That is a viable idea. It has to be given more legs to walk on, and a mind to direct it in that sense. But now in Western Europe, which is potentially a place we can revive the kind of high technology export potential which once existed in Germany, Italy, and so forth. Western Europe has to adopt a mission. Central Europe has to adopt a mission of participating in this development of Eurasia as a group of sovereign nation states through instrumentalities which they create among themselves to facilitate this cooperation. The object would be to bring the United States in to cooperate with that great venture. And when you look at Africa, as you'll have some discussion of that here, Africa has no chance. It's been too looted unless it has help. The help it requires is of the same nature. The primary needs from the outside for Africa, the crucial needs are in the area of basic economic infrastructure, particularly large-scale, extensible systems of large-scale basic economic infrastructure. Transportation links, power grids, water management. The redistribution of water in Africa can make a revolutionary difference in Africa. They needs assistance on this. If Africa is allowed to have the room to undertake its own development with that kind of assistance, Africa can develop. This assistance must come from viable other parts of the world. Prime case, Eurasia. If Eurasia is developing prosperously, then Eurasia will help Africa. But if the Americas and Eurasia are not developing, there will be no help for Africa. And the penalty of what has been done to Africa, like an infectious disease, will continue to destroy Africa, internally and otherwise. And therefore, we should see this connection in the world. Eurasia is the great center of human population. On it there's a frontier. The conquest of inner space of Eurasia is a great focal point for a mission out of this process. When we then turn from Eurasia development to look to Africa and see the misery there, then we see a larger mission which exemplifies humanity as a whole. That's our chance. In the United States, we find in this process, as around the D.C. general fight, which we have not won, but we're fighting as nobody thought we could. In the fight against this deregulation of energy supplies, we're finding a great response from within sections of the American people who have been disregarded and cast aside, the lower 80% of the family income brackets, and who've been out of politics essentially, or out of control of politics for much of the past quarter century and longer. They're responding. They're responding why? Because my friends and I are intervening with people in the Democratic Party, all kinds of people, to bring them together around the idea of establishing the general welfare as a principle. The reference for that is easy. The general welfare principle, as Helga will indicate tomorrow, is an old principle in European civilization. It's one of the characteristic benefits of European civilization to all humanity, that concept as developed. The idea of the sovereign nation state as the alternative to empire. That's the great contribution. But in a most recent period, in a period which is most comparable in immediate recollection to that now, was the period of the Great Depression of the 1930s, when stupidity similar to that which rules the United States today, the stupidity of Teddy Roosevelt, that fascist, the stupidity of Woodrow Wilson, that Ku Klux Klan racist, the stupidity of Coolidge, who talked too much. That's why he didn't talk. He got himself into trouble every time he opened his mouth, so he didn't talk, at least not in public. These people, along with Mellon, destroyed the United States and destroyed much of the rest of the world. So Franklin Roosevelt came in very simply. Franklin Roosevelt had poliomyelitis, was crippled. He fought against the crippling effect of polio, and during this period restudied his own roots. He was a descendant of one of the collaborators of Alexander Hamilton some centuries before. And he studied found again his roots in the American Revolution, and brought forth as governor of New York and as candidate for president of the United States, brought forth a conception which transformed that traditionally ultra-racist party called the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party was conceived as a racist, treasonous party, and remained so until Roosevelt became president, even though there were some decent people in it from time to time. Roosevelt changed that. Roosevelt transformed the Democratic Party from the party of racism and treason into a party which is committed to the promotion of the general welfare. Not that he was able to act with a sweep of the hand to install the general welfare, but he fought to establish the principle. And most important, he fought to establish the principle in the minds of the American citizens. See, we are not emperors. We cannot, with our wave of the hand, declare a principle and then impose it by our will on people. The way we convey a principle is as philosophers in action, who convince people that that principle is the way in which they ought to live and act. And when a people is aroused to act for that principle, then the great good comes. The great good does not, no man is a god. No man can decree by a wave of the hand and give the world something according to principle. What a man can do is what a man can do. An individual human being can develop and transmit ideas, utilize ideas, convey these ideas to others. The function of leadership is essentially that of a philosopher, which few politicians seem to understand. It is the philosopher who conveys and implants ideas in people, ideas of principle, like a scientist who conveys discoveries. It is the implanting of those ideas in the social process, the creation of political and other institutions around ideas, which mobilize humanity to do a great work. So that's the lesson for today. We are in the worst crisis in world history, and the good side of it is there's no way you can cheat. You either do it my way or you're doomed. That's the good side. The other good side is that we can win. But to win, you have to think of philosophers in action. Not as agitators, but philosophers in action, who take people who are living in a depraved way, mental state, who are being selfish. Let me just give you an example of this. What's the principle involved? It may occur to all of you that we are each have been born, and that has a point in time. You weren't born and then you were born. Right? And it has occurred to most of you that all of us are going to die. Even George Bush, who may be already dead for all I know. There may just be a mechanical device up there they use instead and pass them off to us. All right. So therefore, when somebody talks about my self-interest, what is their self-interest? If you're going to die, what becomes of your self-interest the minute you die? Your self-interest in pleasure? Your self-interest in gluttony? The self-interest in riches? What happens to those things? They go. What's your self-interest? Your self-interest is in having lived and having your life mean something to humanity. So you live for your self-interest. Now, most people aren't capable of doing that. Not yet. Given the educational system, it's not surprising. They're not capable of rising to that. But when people are inspired to rise to that sense of their personal self-interest, that what they can do for mankind while they're alive is their self-interest, then they're capable of exerting leadership. If they can do that, they can arouse in people who all have this potential, at least for a moment, the ability to see that in themselves. In the old time, when people used to believe in having babies, long before, people would express that in a very simple way. They would say, all right, I'm living, I'm sacrificing, I'm living, we're working for our children and grandchildren. And the idea of children and grandchildren was not something in itself, it was something that gave you a way of focusing upon concretely what your life meant. And you would joyfully sacrifice for the sake of the future of these children and grandchildren. You would vote and support actions by society. Soldiers were willing to die for their society to save it. They didn't want to die, but they were willing to take the risk. Because they had a sense of there's something that's more important than their mortal life itself. It's what they do with it that's important. Like any great scientist, how do you measure a scientist? It's by what they contribute to humanity. People whose names we know from thousands of years ago. What was their self-interest? Is to be what they were. Great discoverers who benefited all humanity after them. Great artists who uplifted all humanity after them. So a few of us have that. A few of us have that developed commitment. In former times, there were more people who had that kind of commitment, which they expressed in terms of their obligation, improvement of their society, their family, and so forth. Those values have more or less passed away under this decadent period in which we've lived, this decadent cultural period. But we've come to a time when people suddenly realize that my money is not the essence of humanity or life. The essence of the ability to buy is not the essence of life. It's being human that's the essence of life. And when people have taken away from them some of the false values to which they've clung too ardently, sometimes they're forced to look and say, what is really valuable? And sometimes, for that reason, it's the poor who are the best fighters for freedom, because they have the least to lose. And freedom means everything to them, because they have nothing else except the fight for freedom. And so when we come to a time of great peril and depravity and whatnot that we are now, in that time, the secret is leadership. The secret is the development and spread of ideas, sound ideas, which enable people to mobilize themselves about actions which will address the problem. And in such a moment, when that occurs, suddenly the majority of people are able to decide on how to run this planet. And those few tyrants who dominate us become pitiful wrecks running into places of refuge or hiding or changing their identity. Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to greet Mr. LaRouche and Schiller Institute for such an interesting and productive conference. I think that it is a very important event which is taking place just in time before the financial system collapse, and we still have some maybe months or so to think about the future and to think what could be done in order to overcome those bottlenecks and dangers which could appear in the nearest future. For me, it is a great pleasure and honor to participate in this conference and to share some ideas on those subjects which Mr. LaRouche raised in his brilliant presentation. I'd concentrate on regularities which determines the modern economic development, which we must take into consideration thinking about the nearest future and about the actions which could be implemented to overcome the worldwide catastrophe and to find the way out from those crises which Mr. LaRouche described. Mr. LaRouche showed that we are facing the crisis of global financial system and the present global economic order. But how this crisis change the global system? Whether the globalization process stops or it will find the new forms, or perhaps the world economy will collapse in some regions which will try to find out their own way from the chaos, or the world oligarchy will find the new opportunities to create the new global order based on horror, terrorism, or worldwide dictatorship. What could happen? In order to answer all these questions, I think we shall take into account some important features of the present globalization process. Usually, globalization is considered as a process of creating of the world market, which will give more opportunities to each country to develop its own contemporary advantages, to improve its efficiency, to find new ways to cooperate with each other. And according to the mainstream in economic theory, this creation of the worldwide markets also is the creation of the new opportunities and increasing of the efficiency, not only of the world economy, but the efficiency of the economy of each country participating in globalization process. But this is, in fact, not the real true. These are some features which we see at the surface when the governments of even of the most powerful countries diminish their self, destruct their self, in order to give new opportunities for free trade, for free flows of capital, labor, information, thinking that in this free and worldwide free market, they will create at the same time new opportunities for their companies and their people. We must take into the mind the other part, the other side of the medal of the globalization process. In fact, it is not only the integration of the different countries into the one world market, it is also the disintegration of the world, where we can see the very small number of highly developed countries which concentrate wealth, concentrate power, concentrate capital, concentrate information and knowledge, the large periphery of this core of the world economy, where we see growing inequality, poverty, the huge flow out of capital, the huge brain drains, and so forth. And finally, we see also the emerging set of the so-called dead states and even dead countries, which nobody cares what happens there. So the present globalization process includes regularities which leads to the polarization of the countries by means of unequal exchange of goods, capital, and information. The core of the global system, which includes North American, Western European countries, and Japan with some new industrialized countries, in fact concentrate the possibilities to extract rent from all our other world. These possibilities emerged from two main sources. The first source is the leading role of the technological change in the worldwide development. The share of science and technological progress in economic growth at the moment in the developed countries is accountable to 3/4, or according to some calculations, even to the 95% of growth of GDP. It means that those countries and those companies, those structures in the world market which concentrate intellectual potential and which are able to produce new technologies, new opportunities for production and for taking profits, in fact has opportunity to have intellectual rent through the unequal trade with other world, with other partners. Those countries which unable to be at the frontier of the technological change has to produce in exchange has to give in exchange the cheap labor, the natural resources, so they has to finance the economic growth and further development of the core of the world economic system. And this creates a huge inequality in economic exchange. If we look for the present markets, we can see that the science-intensive products has about 50% even more in their price as intellectual rent. These are super profits which they get from the exchange in the market. So, as Mr. LaRouche showed in his speech and in his papers, such kind of economic order inevitably should collapse for obvious reasons which leads to the collapse of any kind of financial pyramid, which we see not only in Russian experience but also in the financial crisis in Asia recently, before financial crisis in Mexico, and so forth. I do not have time to speak about experience of various countries which trying to find their way in this difficult situation. But I am sure that each country could contribute in this. And in Russia, we also have discussion what will be the further economic policy. Either we shall continue to the policy which already caused crash of the Russian economy, continue to the Washington consensus policy without any active role of the government, the policy of self-destruction of the government, and in this case the Russian economy will collapse together with the worldwide financial crisis, or we shall find the way out, trying to find our own opportunities to propose other nations to participate in mutually beneficial programs, including those which Mr. LaRouche mentioned in his very interesting description of the Eurasian corridor developments and so forth. I fully support those ideas which Mr. LaRouche said in his speech about the necessity to develop worldwide infrastructure based on the new technologies. It should include not only the new transportation infrastructure, it should include also, of course, the information infrastructure, telecommunications, research and development institutions which should work on the worldwide level. It should include the worldwide social infrastructure also. I think that we should, the world, at least the leading nations, should come to the common responsibility of about the supply of the basic food, of water, of heat and so forth to the population of the whole world, doesn't matter where the people lives. And the final question, what will happen with the world organizations? At the present, the majority of the world organizations, except maybe the scientific organizations and some social, non-commercial organizations, use the obsolete technology to plan and develop their activity. They are based mainly on the contributions comes from countries participating in these organizations. And it obviously means that if you speak about the main financial organizations, that they are determined by those countries which are the main contributors to the capital and to the opportunities. It is not the secret that the IMF, in fact, is a branch of American Treasury or Federal Reserve. The similar situation with the World Bank. The WTO organization is not the organization of the independent countries, in fact. We know who plays the key role in this organization, and this is the common picture. As far as we are speaking about the new economic order, we should think, I think, about the new architecture of the world organizations, which must have their own opportunities to work at the worldwide level according to their task force. If we come to the situation when the worldwide money creation center appears, it means that together with it, the worldwide credit facilities appears as well. It is very difficult to speak about the cheap credits for the whole world for different countries if you do not have the world financial system. So if we come to the situation when the world currency is establishing, it means that the world organization, which will be in charge of this currency, which should be under the control of the nations which organize this mechanism, also have opportunity to create cheap credits to all over the world. Of course, such kind of ideas couldn't be implemented immediately. I think it is the step-by-step process. But in any case, we should think about the creation of the international investment opportunities, which will be controlled by the nations, but which will be based on their own economic activity. For instance, we could think about the worldwide tax on the transnational corporations. We could think about the worldwide tax on the currency speculations, and to use this taxation, at least for the speculative operations, in order to finance those infrastructure projects which are necessary for the whole mankind. In order to not only to think about all these opportunities, but to implement them, we need the political will. And I hope that this conference will contribute to this. I totally agree with Mr. LaRouche that Russia could play, and perhaps would play, the very important role in establishment that this new world architecture. But unfortunately, the Russian president is not among the participants in our conference. So we have a lot of problems in all the countries. And I hope that this conference will help us to solve these problems and to find the way out from the financial catastrophe. Thank you.
As I notice, the substance, the substantive input and the effect of these conferences is increasing in time. It's not decreasing. You're not going down the hill. You're going up here. After all the discussion of all these global problems, let me say a few words of what I think might happen to Russia when the great crash comes. I think that the situation, as far as Russia is concerned, is dangerous, but it's not fatal. 2 years ago, we still had an evil dummy in the Kremlin, Mr. Yeltsin. This was our Bush in a certain way, because a lot of things he did led to the destruction of the Russian economy. And if he would be around, I would say there wouldn't be any hope. If a crash came, Russia would certainly crash together with the whole world, and nothing would help it. But he's not there anymore, so... And Putin is not a dummy. He has his weaknesses, but he also has a vision of reviving Russia, which is very important. The government and Mr. Putin are fully aware, of course, that some kind of crisis or some kind of crash is coming in the world. Look at the way the Russians draft their budget for the year 2001 and 2002. The philosophy is that we should base the basic budget on a pessimistic assumption. If things turn out to be better, fine. We can earn more that way. We can receive more revenue, but we will not spend that revenue immediately. We will put it in a stabilization fund. This is a new idea, again promoted by Mr. Putin. Put it in a stabilization fund, which will be used partly to repay debts, but partly to finance the country in the poor years, in the bad years. Whether this will be enough to overcome the coming LaRouche crash or not, I don't know, but at least the government is thinking in that way, and that's very important. They're very cautious. They're very cautious. Okay, so now what is the main domestic danger? The main domestic danger is political, and I've pointed to it a few times. The main domestic danger is the liberal advisors and the liberal economists, the liberal political figures that are surrounding Mr. Putin and giving him wrong advice. Now, why are they so dangerous? Because, point number one, their basic philosophy is a do-nothing philosophy, contrary to what Lyndon has been suggesting. You don't wait for the crash to come. You prepare for the coming crash, to fight it, if you can, and with the means that are in your possession. you are, of course, the most un-American American that I have seen. You're very American, of course, because you're traditionally American, but you're from the best part of America. You're the best roots of America, but you're a singular person, because, as my wife Larissa said, where did you see an American who knows so much about, who knows that Renaissance in Italy came at the same time when the Mongols were thrown out from power in Russia? Who in America knows that? They hardly know that you can go Russia west or east, and you'll get there. This is a fact. I've been in a family, an intelligent family, where the ladies were really surprised when I said, well, you know, if you don't have to go across the Atlantic, you can go through the Bering Straits, and there was, you know, that kind of thing. But, so you were an exception, of course. You're not provincial. And you know your history, you know your philosophy, you're a great man. As I said in one of my articles about you in the Russian story about when you were running for president, I said, well, they won't let him in because he's like he's too large for the presidency of the United States. He's like an elephant in the china shop. Who breaks all the American china, cheap china, American china. The gist of what I'm saying is, of course, that the coming crash, if it comes, is not fatal for humanity. I think what Mr. Glazyev said, there are many ways of fighting it, there are many projects that have to be pushed without waiting for the crash to happen. It may happen in spite of the fact that we prepare for it, but we don't have to wait for it to happen. And we also are in need of wise and concerted action for the common good. And here I agree, it's not just a common good inside the countries. A new variation of the old theories of common good inside the country, you know, help the poor and so on. The beverage program and that kind of thing. But the common good is the common concerted actions of nations in the world, aimed at creating a just order. Not the kind of order that we have now, but the just kind of order. And by that action, and I agree with LaRouche here, we shall overcome, we shall win, and that's it.